we're going to talk about how to lull people into a trance with your words. So we're speaking about language, and we're going to talk about the storytelling tradition, the Saga Masters, the poets, and the bards. And the first question we need to ask is, what is language? This is a second part to a previous video called Feel the Word. And the summary of that is synesthesia is a natural condition of humans from adolescent and in pre-literate and non-literate cultures and peoples, because the language conditions the use and the association of the senses. It, in a very literal way, it creates the neural connections. So language is making these shortcuts, and these shortcuts are the processing the neurons that are connecting to different areas and how it's processed. So that was generally what that previous video was about. And we're going to now take it further. English is often said to be a very crude and overcomplicated or convoluted language. And to some extent that's true, but it's mostly in the way that we use it. The way that we use it now is very left hemisphere. So what's the difference between the left and the right hemisphere? The left hemisphere controls the right half of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left half of the body. So the wires cross over like that. The left hemisphere takes information and applies it very vertically. It takes information and looks at it individualistically, very narrowly focused. It's looking for depth of information. It's trying to find what this particular thing means, how it associates with yourself, kind of drawing it out to its absolute furthest points of understanding. The right hemisphere is horizontal. It's looking at information in the broader picture. It's taking a wide scope of information. While our brains aren't as lateralized as birds, the role of the hemispheres are consistent across different species. And so it can help us illustrate the point. As a quick example, birds will look for food with their right eye. So they're processing information with their left hemisphere as they look for food. And then the left eye, right hemisphere, is keeping an eye out for predators. So it's taking a broad view of things and understanding its role or its position in the environment and any potential predators, while the right eye is focused on finding food for itself. Obviously, each hemisphere has its role and function, and both are important, and especially both in communication with each other. The way that print literacy works, the way that we use our language today, is almost entirely confined to the left hemisphere. Wernicke's and Braca's area is not actually where language has to be processed. It's where it's processed in a very specific style, which is very technical, very academic, very definitive. It's needing these specific shortcuts to process information as fast as possible because it's centered around that individualistic, that narrow scope. Another way we can understand the difference between the left and right hemisphere is in spatiality. So left hemisphere is kind of like liminal spaces. It's kind of like skyscrapers. It's these passageways, corridors. It's things built to be narrow and defined to its self. Tunnels and rooms and corridors. That's all very left hemisphere perspective, whereas right hemisphere would be wide open spaces, views of the horizon, taking a distance look at something, understanding the broad scope and scale of things. Finally, just to drive the point home, the left hemisphere could also be compared to highways and roadways. They take you from point A to point B in a very specific, predetermined manner. They do it at extreme efficiency and at high speeds, but you are confined to those roads, right? You can't take your car and drive it anywhere off the road. It needs to be on the highways. The right hemisphere operates more like a horse in the open country. It's free to go in any direction it wants, but that direction isn't going to be nearly as fast or efficient, but it is more of being able to drift or wander. It has more freedom of movement. It has that open space. Again, both have their uses and both have their specialties, but we don't have any horses today, right? It's purely, we need to be efficient, we need to be definitive, we need to be academic and grammarly, and all of these things are very left hemisphere approaches. In my magazine, I reference this exchange between Alice and Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass. Humpty Dumpty says, "When I use a word, it means whatever I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." Alice responds with, The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things. Humpty Dumpty counters with, the question is, which is to be master, that's all. We can use that conversation as an analogy for the left and right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is Alice in this analogy. It's needing to be using these words correctly. It's needing to have a sense of everything makes sense, everything is put in its place, it's divided in the way that it's been conditioned to be. And Humpty Dumpty is the right hemisphere saying, you can use words however you want. They don't own you. They aren't the masters of you. You are the ones using the words. The left hemisphere is being used by words. And this is a broader issue with all of our various fields of study. Everything is very narrowly focused and built up into the height or the fullest depth of information. And it's not communicated with these other fields of study. Right? We have our fields of study are skyscrapers, and there's nothing connecting them to other fields of study. Everything's built up in its own individuality. The language itself, the language and the way that we use it is processed in the left hemisphere, and so it doesn't reach that right hemisphere broader understanding and broader perspective on things. And these words are shortcuts, and the shortcuts allow for that efficiency of processing, but that doesn't necessarily make it better. It's becoming more and more common on the internet especially that people need to say words as fast as they can. If you're presenting information, you need to speak as fast as you can, almost as if you're saying it all in one breath. And that's a sign that you understand the material you're working with, that you're knowledgeable of it, and it puts people into this sense of, I need to be able to process that as fast as possible because I need to catch up to that information. You know it so well, you can talk about it without stuttering or taking a breath. That means you're an authority on this. You obviously know what you're talking about. And this is a very left hemisphere approach because it's trying to create shortcuts within those shortcuts. And it's the opposite of putting people into a trance, which we're going to learn about in a second. But it's putting people kind of into more fight or flight. It's putting you into that individual, I need to get food. I need to hunt for something for myself. It's turned into this accumulation, this need for better efficiency, better understanding, and an endless pursuit of the right definition, the right way of saying something. It's trying to take these highways and turn them into even faster speedways. And we come to the difference between consonants and vowels. Consonants are sounds we make that close off the airways. They're a manipulation of what we're saying by changing the mouth position, changing the tongue, and closing the airways in different ways to vibrate these different sounds. Vowels are an opening of the airways. You say vowels with the airways open. It allows for breath to come in and out. While language is, again, generally processed in the left hemisphere because of print literacy, with the inclusion of vowels, the right hemisphere can actually process language just as efficiently or just as well. It's just as capable. This doesn't mean that it automatically does. There's a specific type of use of vowels that allows the right hemisphere to participate in processing. So just to be clear, it doesn't automatically mean that consonants are left hemisphere and vowels are right hemisphere, but vowels allow in a certain use of them for the right hemisphere to start to process them. And this has to do with when musicality or poetry is introduced into the language, when you take the time to breathe through your words. It's the vowels in music, in singing, that allows for the proper pitch and duration and manipulation of the sound. The consonants are kind of ways to bridge between the different vowels, which are the actual singing parts of singing. And when it becomes musical, when it becomes rhythmic and there's cadence and pitch and various applications of what are called literary devices, then you have right hemisphere processing. When it's not just definitions, when it's playing with imagery, you're using different kinds of metaphors and drawing from examples, personifying things or animating things, turning the world into colors. It's a synesthetic experience, and that's why the previous video is important to understand this one, because poetry is essentially taking sensory information and manipulating it into different ways, into a musical way, into a poetic way, and that allows for the right hemisphere to process that information, to process that language. I want to show you an example. Let's take the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." If we were to remove all the vowels from that sentence, it's still fairly legible. You can, especially in context of, I just said the sentence, you can read the sentence without any hiccups. "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." And this is how many businesses and anything considered to be more technical or legal or academic, very professional, it's meant to be used mainly with consonants. And that's why there's businesses will use acronyms for most of their names, or abbreviations just naturally come up in any technical work, because you're creating shortcuts to shorten what you already have as words. You're going to abbreviate big terms, or you're going to use acronyms for things so you can simply write them out faster, so you can read them out faster. It's easier to take the vowels out because then you don't need to breathe. You can just get all the information out faster and faster. If we take that same sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," and we remove the consonants from it, it just kind of turns into music. All you have are these sounds, and you can't recreate the sentence from that, but it just turns into a sort of flow of air. And that's a good way of highlighting the potential differences in how the consonants and the vowels are used. So let's talk about the Saga Masters, the oral storytelling tradition that humans have used for most of their existence on this planet. For most of our career as humans, this is the mode of interacting with language, of presenting information. There's a very common misconception in the oral tradition which supposes that they recited and memorized information, that they learned information verbatim and they were able to then say that information out. They were able to repeat it. And that's not how the storytelling tradition persisted at all. What happens with these saga masters, these storytellers, these bards and poets, what they actually did was created these stories afresh, each performance. No performance was the same as the other. If we take a look at someone like Homer performing the Iliad, let's say he performed it 1,000 times in his life, each iteration was slightly different. The core narrative was the same, but the performance changed and evolved, and it depended on the night that it was, or the city he was in. If he was in Athens, he would have told the story different than when he was in Thebes. Or even if he was in Athens 2 nights in a row, that story would have been slightly different. Because they didn't actually memorize it verbatim and then repeated the story. They drew from a wellspring of various poetic devices, of different kinds of imagery, and they could have felt the audience out and catered it to who they were performing for. If he was performing for a city that was on the coast, you would use more coastal imagery in your references. If you were in the mountains, you would have used mountain imagery. If you were with farmers or soldiers, you would have highlighted different aspects of the story that helped to bring immersion to these people. What you would end up doing was putting everyone into this right hemisphere experience. And this is that trance-like experience, and especially in a performance when everyone's kind of tuned to that same wavelength, you're having this very immersive, you're being pulled into this trance of the storyteller. And they would, of course, include music, and they have all these rhymes and alliteration and personifications, and they draw from these familiar expressions. Familiar expressions are important because they are right hemisphere language. They're stored and processed in the right hemisphere. I suppose you could say the ironic thing with the left hemisphere in trying to have all of these shortcuts and trying to make language and information sharing as efficient as possible, the right hemisphere is actually what has the most efficient language processing. So familiar expressions are idioms and proverbs and sayings and epithets, even slang terminology. They're words that you don't have to think about what they mean because everyone kind of already knows what they mean. They're familiar expressions. Like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or breaking the ice, or a penny for your thoughts. Whatever the expression may be, they could be unique to a language, to a civilization, to a specific city, to specific culture, subcultures, or demographics. They have words that are familiar expressions, and these are right hemisphere because it's a broad application of language. It's something that everyone understands, and it provides a perspective that's kind of already there for you. You're just drawing from an old saying or an old proverb because it has the answer in that information, or it has a response in that. And that's a right hemispheric language. And so these Saga Masters would pull from various familiar expressions, especially relevant to who they were performing for. And that's how they got these myths to come to life. Everyone was there feeling each dancing of the shadows, each chord on the music was playing on their senses in a very synesthetic way, which allowed for this total immersion, this total trance into the story that was being performed. And so the oral tradition, what's very interesting about it is that it can exist for a million years. These stories, some of these stories can be passed down indefinitely because it's just one generation to the next, the way you would pass down any integral information. Now they evolve and they change. Each generation had its own adaptation and had its own relevancy to the lives that they were living. But there were also new stories that were coming up. Kings or warriors especially would commission these bards and poets to create stories of their exploits. And it was actually a problem that if you were someone who actually defeated a great enemy, and if you weren't the one to go pay the bards, you may have had your credit stolen. Maybe you were a warrior and you were the one that turned the tide of battle, and the general decided to take the credit for it because he got to the bards and the poets first. So the stories can exist for indefinitely, but they can also, new stories can be created. And it's because they could create these stories, they could perform these stories. It gives you a chance to tell stories that have never been told before. Stories today feel very anemic. There's no good writing right now. The writing, whether it's for movies or books, is lacking today. There's really no original stories. And it's kind of been that way progressively since print literacy was on the rise. There's less and less original stories. Everything's kind of a rearrangement of these same archetypes that were passed down from the oral tradition, and now they're just adapting them into movies or into a modern setting or to a book, or just there's a narrative through line that is the same across all these different stories. There's a couple dozen maybe stories out there, and every story is kind of a different iteration of that. There's no new stories because there's no new storytellers. What you're doing when you're writing stories, all you're doing is rearranging these different shortcuts. You're putting characters that were in this archetype into that archetype. I would say print literacy, the writing of print literacy has the same effect as what AI does, which is just amalgamate whatever data exists out there. And AI certainly then would be kind of this progression of what we're already doing with language, which is a natural conclusion of print literacy, is that you're just going to create an algorithm to then have all the possible interpretations of words there for you. All the definitions, all the types of speaking is just written out for you because language is limited in that. Whether it's Homer's Iliad or the Bible or any other of these ancient stories that were passed down for generations through the oral tradition, when they were finally written and copied onto as text, they stopped evolving. The story stopped changing. The story written down is just one iteration that happened to have been written down, and not the full scope or the full evolution of a particular story. At that moment, when you write something down, the idea gets petrified. It gets frozen in stone, and that prevents it from being able to evolve because you say you can't change the story. But that story was never the original story. There is no original story. When they wrote down Homer's Iliad, that's just one version of that retelling, of that performance, and not that it was recited and it accounts for every version of that ever existed. It's just this snapshot, this petrification of that. So what are some ways that we can begin to restore this ability to tell stories, this access to creativity that we lose in the left hemisphere in our efficiency obsession and our intellectual obsession, our literacy and our grammar obsession, the part that says we can't make words mean whatever we want them to mean. How do we start to learn again these skills from the Saga Masters? One of the things you could do is you start to perform for yourself. Maybe you're in an interview, maybe you're giving a lecture, maybe you're in part of a show, or you're a lawyer, or you have to argue or debate a point, or you have to participate in some way. Whatever kind of performance you enjoy. Maybe you're giving a speech, or you're doing a routine on a stadium, or you're performing parts of a story that you want to create. And I mean this literally. Talk out loud to yourself, to an audience of your imagination, in an imaginative setting, whatever it is that your interest ultimately lies in. Or even if it's not something that you really think you'll ever do and you just want to do it because the idea of it would be cool. You perform it out because this is how you start to train. How can you get the audience into a trance? You're training these creative synesthetic experiences, this switch or shift to the right hemispheric language. The more media that we consume, the more we exhaust our creative potential, those creative muscles. If you wanted to write a story, the worst thing you could do to get yourself to write is to read a book. Because reading a book is you interacting with these words and these ideas. And then when you finally sit down to write, you've already used that part of your brain. You've already exhausted your ability to access that. It's like working a manual labor job and then going home and being like, okay, now I want to work out. Well, you've already burnt through that energy. You've already burned through those muscles. And so when we're consuming all of these movies and videos and books, we're just stifling any of that creative potential. We're exhausting the part of us that wants to interact with the imagination, with creativity, with performing stories. So read less books and perform, even to yourself, these stories. You've read all the stories are out there. You don't need to keep reading the same story in a different way. What you should do is learn how to experience them in a different way, learn how to perform them in a different way, learn how to even create them and to tell them. And just in general, in your day-to-day life, when you spend more time practicing different ways of using language, speaking in rhymes or riddles, using familiar expressions or idioms, saying things with more colorful imagery, more vivid imagery, saying things in a synesthetic way, crossing different sensory experiences. All of those types of language is activating the right hemisphere. When you're talking to people like that, it can put them into that right hemisphere experience, and that's putting them into that trance where you're saying something very poetical, and that allows people to then feel that in a way that you can't experience when you're abbreviating everything, when you're just saying things as fast as possible, when it's very consonant heavy and it's very noisy, and you're just doing these shortcuts. The right hemisphere is taking the forest for the trees, and the left hemisphere is speaking of only a single leaf. Both have their uses, but all we've done is narrow it down to this telescopic view of one thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. And there's no stepping back and looking at everything and letting yourself be immersed in feeling all of these different sensory experiences. This is also why emojis have become so important and so popular. There is things you can't express simply through the division of the senses in the left hemisphere that we have with our definitions and grammar, is that there's ways of conveying information outside of the pure word definition, the pure shortcuts. You need to have facial expressions. You need to have different images and pictorial representations of these ideas. And a brief reminder that language started when it was first written, everything was pictorial in the equivalent of the words. And then eventually you turned it into letters and specific, everything kind of started to get a numerical value. And then you make written language out of that. And the more we use written language and the more print literacy became widespread, the more the left hemisphere language became the dominant factor in how we interact with everything, including even how our brain works, how our neural connections form, how our senses integrate and connect to the sensory organs. There's also a hidden aspect to language, which is that words have shadows to them. It's kind of like reading between the lines. A good example that captures the feel of this is someone says or does something and they look around the room and they see that nobody noticed something that they said or a hidden meaning of something that they said. And maybe you catch their eye and there's this exchange of glances and unspoken communication happens where they know that you know and you know that they know that you know. And there's this understanding that you picked up on this little hidden thing that they said. And that could happen whether it's talking to someone or reading something. You're able to see information that feels very personally and individually targeted towards you. Something where you may get someone's reference, or you see someone who writes a sentence and or uses a phrase in a particular way, and that is familiar to you, and you know that where they got that idea from, or you know what they're referencing with that. You've kind of seen that before. There's information outside of those shortcuts that is carried by words. Words carry ideas, but those ideas aren't confined to the definition that we associate them with. Again, it's that eye contact equivalent to language. You can have a knowing glance where no words are needed, but words also have that where there's a kind of subtext, I suppose you could say, despite any context or definition that may translate and be processed to you in a way that isn't your left hemisphere. It's something that will be processed in the right hemisphere. And so word shadows are another way to kind of put people into a trance, to lull them into this wavelength that allows them to be immersed in whatever it is you're saying or writing, or for you to be immersed in whatever you're reading or listening to. You could say that there's an intentionality or Easter eggs that could be written into words or spoken into words that exists outside of grammar and definition and the academic left brain approach or processing of everything. It's interesting too because English was a very storyteller's language. It was a very musical language, and it still is, but we've certainly partitioned how we use language when and where. We can't use poetic terms in any sort of legal or academic or anything meant to be professional, any business or anything like that. You stay away from poetic language. But then we have this huge music industry and so many different types of genres and singers and musicians and artists creating all this music, and it's generally very popular around the world too because English is meant to be a right hemisphere language. It's meant to be very breathy with a lot of imagery. We have some of the most words because it kind of is a combination of many different languages, but we have so many words that can be used in any way that you want. And English is a right hemisphere language being, and I would say probably most languages are right hemisphere languages, but through print literacy, it's been transformed into a left hemisphere language. Some languages still maintain a lot of that right hemisphere processing, such as Mandarin. Because it's a tonal language, it has this sort of musicality built into how you understand a word, which is then going to be processed in the right hemisphere when you introduce a musical, poetic quality to it. When you introduce imagery that exists in a broader scale, that's something you can't just shortcut, something that has to be felt rather than defined. I think there's a lot more we could talk about, but to not overemphasize the role of the brain, I think is important because that is itself a very left hemisphere approach to say, okay, how does this work with this? How does this part work with that? How do you define that? And so a basic understanding, I think, is more than enough. And then being able to just spend more time making words poetic. One thing I did forget to mention is the main way that vowels become right hemispheric language is through assonance. Assonance is kind of what makes a sentence poetic. It's the repetition of vowel sounds in close proximity that creates a built-in musicality to a sentence. So assonance, when you can include more of that into your writing, into your speech, that's one of the ways you can start to put into the audience or the listener into a trance by creating musicality in your sentences. Now, when you have assonance, and then you include all of these various literary and poetic devices and familiar expressions, that's when you get the full range of this synesthetic, this immersive experience of someone being put into that story and feeling it more than just reading it technically, right? You can analyze a line of poetry and remain in the left hemisphere, but when you're actually immersing yourself in the performance, feeling the imagery, and allowing for the musicality to shift you into the right hemisphere is when you start to experience it in ways that words can't describe, because there are ideas or there's information in words that exist outside of the definitions that exist outside of the shortcuts. But that is it for this video. Thanks for watching.